Bluegrass Airport is an American aviation story. Its remarkable history has been chronicled through a series of oral history interviews. We are speaking with Charlie Monette, a flight instructor for over 40 years and founder and co-owner of Aerotech, a flight training school at Bluegrass Airport. Charlie, do you recall when you first became interested in flying?
No, not really. I don't think there was a particular moment in my time, in my lifetime, that I just said, oh, today I want to be a pilot, and before that I didn't. It was kind of an evolution. I think I was around airplanes for a long time. We lived near the airport, and I had that association with them, and then I did develop that interest, and I joined the Civil Air Patrol as a young person, and which fostered my interest in aviation. And at some point in time in the Civil Air Patrol, I went for a couple rides with some of the senior members who were taking lessons at the time, and which introduced me to a place where I could take a lesson, and so I did. I started taking lessons there, but I think it was kind of an evolutionary thing.
Did you have any aviation idols?
Well, of course, as a young person, you know, back then we were all enamored with the feats of Chuck Yeager and the likes of him that were going on, and the people that were flying the jets. They were rather remote from us, and you know, Bob Hoover back in that era was kind of my, I don't want to say a hero, but I admired him and just thought he was the greatest pilot in the whole universe. And so that was it. I didn't have anybody really close to me that was a pilot that I knew and that acted as a mentor at all to me.
When did you first come to Lexington?
Well, my first observation of Bluegrass Airport was kind of amusing. I came here, I came for training. I worked for IBM, and I came here to take a training course. And I flew in here. I was from New England at the time. And having been exposed to LaGuardia Airport and JFK Airport in my previous life, and I came here, and it was this little round terminal building, and they had the baggage claim outside under the awning, and that was the whole thing. And I found that rather quaint at the time, to tell you the truth. And that was my first time to be in Lexington and also at Bluegrass Airport. Well, that was in 1964.
Was your family supportive of you learning to fly?
Yeah, my family really was they were supportive when I first began learning to fly. I was taking lessons up in New York, as a matter of fact. I started at a little airport in Amityville, New York, called Zahns Field. And when I graduated high school, I went into the Air Force with the intention of being a pilot in the Air Force at that point. But that didn't work out well for a number of reasons, medical mostly. And then, and so I put my flight training on hold. So those early on lessons, yes, they were supportive of me. Of course, after that, I was gone from home, and by the time I took the rest of my flight training, I wasn't close to the family anymore.
Talk about your career path in aviation.
Well, at some point, after I took flight training and became a flight instructor, I still worked for IBM for quite some time, and I decided right here at Bluegrass Field to begin doing some flight training, and I did that as a freelance flight instructor. I bought an airplane, and I arranged with one of the FBOs on the field to keep my airplane there and to keep a schedule for me there. And I began just as one person in one airplane, just doing a little flight instruction. And as a part-time thing, I worked at IBM at the same time until after a little bit, some other flight instructors joined me, and I ended up getting additional airplanes in my fleet, and before I knew it, I had almost a full-fledged company even though we didn't even have a permanent place to be or even a phone number. And so we've grown over the years, and even while I worked there at IBM, ultimately Arlene, who was one of my freelance flight instructors, agreed to come to work full-time and actually run the business, you know, for us right here at Bluegrass Field.
Charlie, what year did you start giving flight instruction here?
Well, I began you know, the business and doing the flying here in 1971. It's hard to imagine it's been 40 years that we've been doing flight training on Bluegrass Airport. Arlene began working as a part-time flight instructor, you know, with me in about 1979, and then, 1979 probably, and it was in 1984 when she agreed then to quit her day job, if you will, and then become the manager and full-time flight instructor of Aerotech on the field.
Has the emphasis at Aerotech always been flight training?
Well, we've gone through evolutions through the years, different business aspects, and you know, now we're almost exclusively a flight training organization now, although we do have a small FBO operation down at the Russell County Airport. But for some period of time, we actually, excuse me, we actually ran a charter operation from Bluegrass Airport here.
Would you talk about learning to fly?
Well, when I took my very first lessons, it was in a little yellow Piper Cub, as a matter of fact. But by the time I resumed my flight training I resumed my flight training after I moved to Lexington, and then I was flying actually in a Piper Colt, again a very simple airplane, fabric-covered airplane. And I did that flying, the initial flying, actually at the old Marshall Field out in Georgetown. Back then it was a grass strip, about 1,800 feet, soccer field today.
What would you say is your most triumphant moment relating to flying?
Well, of course, being in the flight instruction business and having run a flight school now for 40 years here, you know, probably the best achievement that we've had, and I say we because we have it as an organization. It's certainly not just my personal achievement, but we've had a 40-year safety record of perfect safety. No one's ever been injured. Nobody's ever been hurt flying at Aerotech, and to me that's probably my major accomplishment of having been able to do that for that many years.
Tell us about the changes you've seen at Bluegrass Airport over the years.
Having been here for 40 years, one of the things that's been fascinating about being on Bluegrass Airport for that long is the continual evolution of this airport. The facilities and the runways, you know, and the personnel there. If you think back to 40 years ago, the building that we're in today and the hangar, to the best of my knowledge, is the only existing structure on the airport that was here 40 years ago when we first began. And oh, by the way, I began the business in that building 40 years ago. So I think that the continual evolution of how things have changed here over the years, you know, have been an asset to the business and certainly made, because they've all been improvements overall.
You've met so many people over the years at Bluegrass Airport. Are there any characters that particularly come to mind?
There's one fellow that comes to my mind when you use the term character, and there's a fellow called Tag Veal that used to be here, and he did many years ago traffic watch here on the field. People used to call him Captain Tag at the time, and you say, well, did he have an influence on the airport? And the answer is yes, I do think he had an influence on the airport, mainly because all over town, people were used to listening to him, the pilot, giving the traffic reports, always from Bluegrass Airport. And I think he gave a face to being a pilot and being at Bluegrass Airport, which made the airport probably a little bit more visible to the average citizen that wouldn't necessarily have been aware of it. So he was certainly one of the people that I would call a notable character around here. You know, lots of other folks over the years have worked here, been associated with the airport, and certainly had good influences on the airport. From our standpoint, being pilots, one of the people, we talk with the control tower a lot, okay? And we have sometimes a nice personal relationship with the people in the tower, and there used to be a tower controller over there who was very, very good. His name was Scotty McFadden, and he just seemed to have a personal relationship with all the pilots that flew in and out of here. He could tell every pilot by their voice that flew in and out of here. So, it made a very pleasant experience for all the pilots flying in here, because that controller was not just the disembodied voice that you might have on the frequency.
What changes in the aviation industry have forced you to change the way you do business?
Certainly, the biggest change that forces us into a way of doing business, if you will, is the security and the security measures that we have to take. Gone are the days when you can have young people that, or any people for that matter, that just come out, hang around the airport, hang around the airplanes, and kind of enjoy being at the airport. And the airport has become a much more restrictive place in the eyes of the public. We always have these fences everywhere now with restricted areas on there. And as a business, we have to certainly do additional things for security measures. We have to have badges in order to get out the door, really, onto our ramp. And so those have been a major influence on our business. And of course, in recent years, every student that we have to at least vet the fact that they're American citizens, okay, or if not, we have to go through Homeland Security to get approval before they can even take any flight training. So there is that portion of it.
Talk about some of the airport managers you worked with over the years.
We worked with Logan Gray, we worked with Mike Flack, and of course we worked with Mr. Gobb, and of course with Eric. Okay, we had a very nice relationship with Mike Flack in particular. I always enjoyed working with him. He just seemed to be a real easy fellow to get along with, and we're enjoying working with Eric now, because he's seems to be very aware of what we're doing and what we're doing over in general aviation. You know, at general aviation, to a large degree, from the public standpoint, is almost a different entity, if you will, on the airport. And of course, our focus is entirely on general aviation. And as an airport manager, most of your focus is related to airline operations, and we realize that. But Eric has been very good at interfacing on the general aviation side, I think.
Are there conflicts between commercial and general aviation?
From the segments of aviation, the general aviation folks and the airline folks, you know, from our standpoint, no, we cohabitate quite well and work together, because pilots work with pilots, and they're pretty respective of each other's talents and each other's of needs, and that works quite well. There have been periods in the history of Bluegrass Airport where those of us in general aviation felt like we were kind of neglected over there, and that most of the focus of the aviation management or the airport management was geared entirely towards the airline industry, and we were just a, a second thought over there. I don't feel that way at all now or in recent years. It's been much better.
Do you interact much with the private aviation side of the business?
Well, as a flight school over there, we are a little bit separated, if you will, from most of the folks that fly in and out of here. Certainly there's more folks that fly in and use, for instance, TAC Air over there nowadays. And folks, that are notable and well known that we wouldn't, as a flight school, actually have contact with. From our perspective, when we were a charter company, we did, do charter flights for some of the higher, well-placed people. Probably the most notable person that we ever did a charter with was for Gerald Ford. Right after his presidency, we did a charter for him, and that was kind of an interesting thing for us because it was outside of our norm. And while we're in the charter business during that period of time, we probably did charter flights for all the governors of Kentucky at one time or another. So, mostly it was Kentucky people of some sort that we had business with. But on the general aviation side, people from all over the world are going through TAC Air.
Would you talk about some of the dignitaries that came through Bluegrass Airport?
Well, sure. We're always here when those people come, and sometimes, when presidents or vice presidents come, and when the Queen comes, there's special security things that happen around the airport, and then we have to make certain accommodations to that and to those security interests while those folks are here, and certainly when they're coming and going. But usually they come and go, external to what we do on the airport. To tell you the truth, we're quietly teaching people to fly over our little piece of the airport.
Charlie, do you have any favorite training stories?
Probably, again, one of the most memorable stories for me, certainly now that I'm married to Arlene, was back from when she was my student and she was only 16 years old, and it was her 16th birthday, and we soloed her, and I sent her up to do 3 takeoffs and landings on the main runway here. And as a good instructor, I was observing from the ground, and what I observed is first she was on one runway, then she was on another, and then she was on another, and by the time her flight was done, she had literally landed on every runway that was on the airport at the time, and I was quite upset that she was not doing a very good job up there. And so when she came down, I was ready to really chastise her for what in the world was going on up there, only to find out when she got out of the airplane, came marching across the ramp and fire in her eyes, because she was sure that I had put the air traffic controllers up to sending her all over the airport on her first solo flight as a joke. So as it turns out, it just was the way it worked out, that she ended up having to land on all those runways to accommodate the traffic that was happening. But it was kind of amusing after the fact.
Any other memorable moments come to mind?
Well, of course, we've taught thousands of people to fly over the years, and I guess one of the things that I find rewarding, if you will, is finding out where many of these people ended up in their flying careers after they left us. And we literally have, some of our students that have been taking jobs and flying in airlines and large airplanes literally all over the world. I just recently trained a student here that left here and went to Nepal, and he's flying airplanes in Nepal now. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, and seeing how even the local fellas, we had a young fella that worked for us when Arlen first came to work, and we actually made it full-time business. And he was a young fellow. He was 16 at the time, and took training. And he literally became the safety manager and chief pilot for Singapore Airlines. And he started right here at Bluegrass Airport. So he's near and dear to our heart because he was our go-to kid whenever we needed something back in the old days. And you know, again, some of our graduates, both from training and as employees, you know, have taken responsible jobs in aviation at the FAA, and one of them is the FESDO manager, and at the Louisville FESDO is actually a Aerotech alumni, if you will. Well, I think the main thing to talk about is the fact that that Bluegrass Airport, you know, or any airport, but for us, Bluegrass Airport is a little community in of its own, and you have somewhat of a relationship with all the people, the employees on the airport management, you know, in many cases, and the other operators on the field, and even the air traffic controllers up there. And there's very much a sense of everybody working together as a team, trying to put this whole thing together, and that people do feel a sense of we're all trying to make this you know, a good place. You know, obviously we try to make it a good place over on our side for the operations we do, and the airline, you know, folks up here try to make the airline experience a good experience for their folks over there. And we see this sometimes, and you know, we see this in some of the meetings that we have here. That's you know, for the airport tenants over there, and I think that's a nice feeling, you know, to feel part of that community, and feel that the people, you know, in the airport do have that feeling, and you can count on them in many cases.
So there is a sense of camaraderie between people in aviation.
Yes, you know, very much so, and there's that camaraderie. You know, pilots obviously have that, or maybe it's not obvious to everybody else, but pilots certainly have that. But people in aviation generally have that sense of being part of the aviation world, and it takes on a slightly different connotation than perhaps other industries.
How have the requirements for learning to fly changed over the years?
Yeah, you know, the age limits for flight training really haven't changed, and the overall requirements for flight training haven't changed. We talked about Arlen soloing on her 16th birthday, and that's certainly the minimum age that somebody can solo is the 16th, and they have to be 17 to get a license. And yes, that hasn't changed at all. You know, that's probably been that way since the 1940s, and I don't expect to see that change at all. Now, in today's environment, there's certainly more things that we teach people. Now, the question comes up, it's called, well, if you're going to send someone up on a solo flight, how do you make that decision that it's the right time to send that person up on their solo flight? And there's certain things that an instructor looks at to make sure that that person is able to handle some unexpected things that might come up. The person has generally consistent aircraft control, and just has you know, enough judgment to make those individual decisions that have to be made, and perhaps ask for some help if they need it. But it's definitely a judgment call, and we've been fortunate that in our 40 years in the history here, that not a single person on a solo flight has ever had even the smallest mishap. So that's a good thing.